Welcome back to another edition of NFA segment here at Whale, where we discuss different aspects of quote unquote investing in the NFT space. As the name suggests, this is not financial advice. There's absolutely no substitute for doing your own research. For those of you new to the community, I'm your host, Iluscavia, and I'm a recovering TradFi professional. Got a background in capital markets where I spent over 15 years. In today's edition of NFA, we welcome back Phoenix, a thought leader on asymmetric strategy theory. Last time he joined us, he discussed the OODA Loop. Today, we will examine it in action. Phoenix, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
No, it's always a pleasure. I feel like I walk away with more questions and research every time I talk to you.
That's the intent. The questions are the most important part. The answers, not so much.
Fair enough. So it's all about the thought process.
Yep, it's a process.
And so last time you were here, we introduced the community to the OODA Loop, the mental and decision-making framework proposed by John Boyd, who I see that you are sporting his image as your avatar today.
Yes.
Do you care to give a brief overview for those of us that weren't able to join us last time?
Yeah, basically, OODA Loop is a graphical depiction of how one's orientation functions within our universe or environment. That you might, I don't know if you're going to put a picture of it there. Oh, there it comes. So if you magnify the actual loop itself. So what we talked about last time, and I would tell people as you're exploring OODA Loop, I really want you to focus on that blue square. That's the most important part. Basically, that's our internal operating system. For us as humans, we simultaneously fire off of all of our experience and education and psychological state and emotional state and our ability to our past history, our previous experiences. He lists 5 things there, but there's a lot more to it. All of our mental models, all of our everything, all of our understanding, it's all inside of that blue square. The one important thing I would highlight is the one on the sort of upper right, the ability to analyze and synthesize. So in other words, our ability to break down information and build it back into something new that didn't exist. Basically, what's speaking to you now and what's hearing me now, all of that is processing through our orientation, our internal operating system. It's important because if you see flowing out of our orientation, there's 2 arrows, one that points to observe and one that points to act. And it says implicit guidance and control. The reason that's there is because our orientation, what we think, what we believe, who we are, what we've learned, what our emotional state is, what our psychological state is, etc., all of that shapes or guides and controls how we observe the world that we're inside. So if we're talking, if I know a lot about cryptocurrency and I know a lot about Bitcoin and other things, and that's inside my orientation, that's going to shape how I look at capital markets. That's going to shape how I look at different fluctuations. On the same hand,
not to be too reductionist, but this is similar to understanding that the old adage that when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's an appreciation that the way you perceive the world colors the way you act in it. And just to not belabor the point, one of the things you brought up last time is that recognizing the way we think and how others think allow us to make better decisions. And the faster we can go through this process, the better off we will be able to act in uncertain environments. Is that a good summary?
Yes, and I would add to it that you want to master this in order to improve your capacity for free and independent action, whether it's as a trader, whether it's as a driver, whether it's at a consumer in a grocery store, right? You constantly you have a differentiated orientation from everyone else. And the faster that you can cycle through that process of observe, orient, decide, and act, assuming that your orientation is matched to reality, the faster that you can operate through that cycle, the more likely you are to be successful, or the more effective you would be.
So in essence, a properly functioning OODA loop can be the determining factor between success and failure.
If, and there's a big if, if one's orientation is matched or aligned to reality effectively. If not, then you're gonna have problems. Your decision cycle will essentially crash. The more disconnected and disjointed you are from things as they really are, and you continue to cycle through that process, but however your orientation is not aligned to unfolding circumstances, outside information, it's not aligned to the realities of the environment that you're in, whether it's the crypto space or capital markets or, again, the grocery store, your OODA loop is going to slow and ultimately crash over time, because all of your observations, all of your decisions and actions will be disjointed from your environment.
So I don't want to get into too much about determining what is reality or not. That's a little too metaphysical for today. But I figured that we could spend a little bit of time explaining how, or going through examples where a broken OODA loop led to failure and where a properly functioning one led to success in a changing situation.
Sure.
So to that end, I was thinking that we might look at the corporate world and try to use examples that a large number of people might be able to identify.
Yep.
And I was thinking in particular the famous study of Blockbuster versus Netflix.
Sure. That's a really simple one to start with. And of course, there's lots of information about those two, but you can overlay this diagram on it and think it in those terms, and it's very effective. So just remember that OODA is fractal. So it scales at every level, whether me as an individual or if I'm on a team with other individuals, or I'm part of an organization or a company or a culture, right? We share certain commonalities within our orientation where we find alignment, where we can, for example, if we're all part of the whale community, at some point, even though our every orientation is unique, at some point we do have alignment where we're talking about these types of subjects and agreeing on certain things. Well, a company is the same way. So another way to maybe look at like a company culture, right? That might be a good way to explain how it scales from the individual into a group of individuals. So in Blockbuster's case,
and just before you get started, for those of you in the audience that may not understand who Blockbuster is the traditional old school video rental service where you would go in, physically borrow or rent a movie, usually cassettes and then eventually DVDs. And that was the model. It was a physical item and delivery, but it required you to go to the store.
Yeah, it was a retail experience, and it was run by the CEO. The last CEO, I believe, was he had a retail background. I believe he was at something like 7-Eleven. But anyway, Blockbuster, for anybody that's old enough, I certainly am. In fact, I used to meet my then fiance. We used to meet at Blockbuster to go pick out a movie together on Friday night. It was a massive experience. They had movie popcorn popping. They had signs. They had TVs playing movies. They had all sorts of cutout displays with actors. I mean, it was a big deal. And then when you went there, if they didn't have your movie, you'd have to settle for something else. But the whole experience of going to Blockbuster, to get a VCR tape to take home to watch was a really big deal in those days. And Netflix came online, and everybody's familiar with Netflix because you can stream things on Netflix through your iPhone, iPad, and everything else. But when it first started out, it actually was sending DVDs in the mail. Like you could have the DVDs mailed to your house, watch it, and then return it via the mail, and then pick something else out, and then they would send it to you, and you'd watch it, and you'd send it back. So you wouldn't have to go to a store. And over time, that evolved to what we currently know Netflix as today. Well, let's go back to when Blockbuster was still a thing. Blockbuster could have purchased Netflix. I believe the amount was somewhere probably, double-digit millions, maybe around 50 million. You can pull up on Wikipedia and learn the story on this one. And there's actually my favorite video on this is on the Cold Fusion channel. If you're familiar with Cold Fusion on YouTube, Blockbuster, the fall of Blockbuster is one of their better videos, I think. Anyway, so Blockbuster sees itself as a retail store and a retail experience, and Netflix sees itself as a get movies to your place of watching faster business, right? So you can see how two orientations are completely diverged. One's focused on a retail store, brick and mortar. They had stores all over the country. And the other one's focused on how can we get movies to people in their homes faster without having to have that brick and mortar experience. Well, when one competitor is thinking of itself as retail, the other one is thinking as itself as rapid home video delivery, you can start to see where things are diverging. Blockbuster.
So right there, you're talking about the difference of experiential versus convenience. And given that a lot of, let's just say that prior to the pandemic, a lot of investment trends were about the experience and less so than the physical goods. Why was Blockbuster's orientation toward experience, in essence, a broken orientation relative to the consumer convenience?
I would suggest that their recency bias was derived largely from the fact they were sitting a massive fortune that was built on a retail video experience. So that jaded, or rather that implicitly guided and controlled how they saw something like Netflix. And if you can, I mean, again, this is a very well documented case. I mean, they laughed at Netflix. Netflix went and presented to them what it was, and they were going to sell it for $50 million. And Blockbuster could have bought Netflix for $50 million, I think. And they laughed. Like the Blockbuster, the CEO laughed them out of the place, you know, and Netflix went on to become Netflix, right? And Blockbuster is now extinct. But when a firm like Blockbuster, you know, and you're a senior decision maker and you've literally made your entire fortune on the current model, you're less likely to challenge that model or challenge that assumption because you think that you're correct and you're talking from a position of you're looking at it more with maybe say an attritional mind versus a guerrilla mindset, right? Where Netflix, you know, guerrilla warfare, like, you know, Netflix is more nimble, it's smaller, it's got a differentiated mission. You can see how it's gonna pull away from Blockbuster because Blockbuster was in the retail business. Netflix is going to be in the, you know, get the movies into your home as fast as we can business. So those, and then it turns out, what do people want? Like, what did the consumer want? What was the value to the consumer? Well, I want movies in my house fast. So you can get movies into my house and it saves me gas, it saves me time, and it's less of a hassle. Fine. Then I'm going to go with Netflix. And then that becomes my own as a consumer. That directly influences my own orientation. And now I'm going to benchmark my, you know, home movie watching experience, you know, vis-a-vis Netflix, not Blockbuster.
So it seems to be that when we're talking about experience versus convenience, there's an element of that convenience that's actually an experience that maybe Blockbuster was missing. You yourself mentioned it a little bit when you were talking about the Blockbuster business model, that if they didn't have the movie, you had to settle for something else.
Right.
And that actually is an experience. It's a negative one that there's something you want, you don't get it. And from the outside looking in, it seems that Netflix's vast DVD library initially oftentimes assured that there was a higher likelihood of you getting what you wanted when you wanted it. Now, yes, they did have some delays for less popular titles, but streaming now seems to have pretty much fixed that. Now it might be an issue of having too much choice.
Could be, yeah. So now when I benchmark Netflix, I look at other now, because now Netflix is exclusively streaming and creating content. Now I'm comparing it to other streaming services and content creators. You know, like my personal preference is Amazon Prime. I feel like I like the selection. I've amassed a collection of movies, you know, that I watch and my family watches, and we're watching it on Amazon Prime. Like I rarely look at Netflix anymore. But when Netflix reoriented me or shattered my model or shattered my understanding of the home movie experience, I quickly jettisoned Blockbuster and went to Netflix, right? So it's so you can see how it's multivalent, right? Like, so you have Blockbuster versus Netflix, but then you have all the consumers, you have all the investors, you have all the other people that have an interest in that back and forth between the two. And Netflix, through a very differentiated orientation, was able to have more of an influence on the consumers to the point where Blockbuster ends up going extinct in the long run, because people now are oriented to a better quality experience that Netflix seems to be more aligned to. So those consumers that were previously aligned to the Blockbuster model, that connection, that correspondence was shattered by Netflix's novelty and their differentiation of mission, which turns out is more in line with what people wanted, or was able to get more people to tip that way, or to lean that way, so that they would continue to grow and Blockbuster would go extinct.
So it seems that what Blockbuster really came up against was what's called the innovator's dilemma. It's they were caught between protecting what they had and being beholden to what they had and made them successful in the past, and not knowing how to deal with a new upstart that was having a new business model that wasn't wound up being superior.
Yeah.
How can an incumbent, like in this case Blockbuster, how could they guard themselves against that decision paralysis, against that well, you mentioned it earlier, that recency bias, that behavioral bias, that what made them successful in the past and they extrapolate to the future and they actually miss the turn. How can a company sort of, or even an individual, protect themselves against that?
Great question. I would say that the larger, more bureaucratic, more corporate, the harder it is to react to a Netflix. Like, it was very hard for Blockbuster. First of all, Blockbuster laughed them out of the room, and I did verify it was 50 million in 2000. So Netflix was valued at 50 million when Blockbuster at its peak was 8.4 billion was what it was worth. And they had 2,800 stores, and that's their mindset, right? So here's Netflix coming in, and let me be specific to your question again. So how would a Blockbuster do that? Well, Blockbuster would have had to have challenged their assumptions on what people actually wanted, and that was probably heresy inside the halls of Blockbuster when they're worth 8.4 billion and they have 2,800 stores. And there's me walking around saying, hey, we should look at this Netflix model because it might change the way videos are delivered, or it might change the way people experience movies in their home. Everybody's going to laugh at me, right? Well, they're going to laugh me out. I'm going to go work for Netflix, right? But it's very hard for a company that size, that scale, that successful. I mean, they're basically Goliath, and Netflix is a David, and the Goliath's going to laugh at David until the slingshot stone goes right in his head and he's dead, right? So Blockbuster probably like the bigger and more bureaucratic and the more centralized decision making is, the harder it's going to be to adapt your mindset for a more nimble, agile competitor like a Netflix.
So it basically boils down to challenge assumptions, and there are no sacred cows, as it were.
Well, that's a very hard thing in a corporation, because their companies are going to have a very hard time getting away from whatever it is that got them there. For example, like Kodak, right? They're not going to be able to think digital photography. They're not going to be able to think digital photography in all of our pockets, and children are using digital photography daily, taking thousands of pictures per week, because they put everything in terms of film. So they're oriented towards film and their success and their legacy, and the fact that they're part of the Dow Jones and they've made all their fortune on film. That's going to shape how they see things. And
the irony is that Kodak was actually an early adopter of the digital photography through their Kodak Gallery, which is now defunct. But I think it wound up being sold to Flickr or one of these other services, maybe even Shutterfly. But they were there. They just didn't
Yeah,
appreciate
they were
it.
there. They developed it. They were one of the premier developers of digital photography, and even Polaroid. Similar story. They were one of the early developers of making really good digital cameras, and they were so wedded to their process. They were so committed to their biases, their programming. For what they've always done, it was very hard for them to imagine a world without that. It's even harder when I'm a very successful executive and I'm doing it from my summer home, right? I'm not gonna be able to create that, that necessary discomfort that's going to be required to challenge assumptions to see if what I'm doing, is aligned with what the market wants or what the market might want. It's going to be very hard for me to change and get over myself, so to speak. So I think that's really, like successful, well, not successful, but I'm saying an innovative company might say, you know what, we're going to have a red team, and a red team is somebody that's going to be like an internal.
I was wondering when you were going to bring this up. I know it's one of the ways that we've discussed in the past as a way for a company to, let's say, guard themselves against this.
Yeah, it's rooted. It's actually it's a very interesting history. There's two great books on red teaming. One by Mike Gazenko and one by Bryce Hoffman. But I think both
have
of them
the Bryce Hoffman up already on stream.
Yeah, the Bryce Hoffman book is I think a lot more. I would recommend that one first. The other one is extremely academic. But put it this way. So like both of them trace the roots of red teaming back to the term. You've heard the term devil's advocate. And what that was a way for the Catholic Church to challenge, like somebody was being proposed for sainthood. They had the avocatus diabolus, so like they had a devil's advocate to basically challenge and see if that person was worthy of becoming a saint. So in other words, they had a thesis, and they intentionally sought to get an antithesis or an antithesis to try to maybe find some synthesis, which is of course part of orientation. But that's what companies would probably want to do. They'd want to have somebody or a group, the military is very good at this, where they have an internal group challenging assumptions, challenging plans in order to uncover potential blind spots, in order to uncover potential mismatches that could cause problems down the road. So, but you have to, the first rule of red teaming, it's like if the leadership is against it and closed off to it, it ain't happening. And then the red teamer just becomes the local heretic that gets, and in history, what happens to heretics, right? They don't get burned anymore. I think they get thrown out and fired or, laid off or whatever, because speaking truth to power can be a very dangerous thing. Another term might be Cassandra. If you remember from the Battle of Troy, Cassandra, her punishment was to tell everybody the truth and no one would believe her. And I think that's what a red teaming operation or a red teamer that doesn't have support or leadership basically becomes Cassandra, could become Sandra, running around telling everybody the truth, and then nobody believes, nobody listens, nobody cares. So like, go back to Blockbuster, you're running around an $8.4 billion company saying, hey, this little $50 million company can get movies quicker, and there's no retail experience other than through the mail, and people don't have to drive to a store, and they don't have to wait in line, they don't have to find parking, and they don't have to do all this. Maybe we should look at something like that. That could be a blind spot down the road. And then they all laugh at him. What are you talking about? You're nuts. We're the king of home movies, home entertainment. We have a football game. It was the Blockbuster Bowl named after us, right? You heretic. What do? Run them out.
Well, the irony is that now there's a documentary called The Last Blockbuster that you can watch on Netflix.
There you go.
So not
full circle.
Yeah, the irony. Now, one thing that I wanted to kind of explore, since I know we have a hard stop coming up in a half hour. One of the things that I also want to discuss is a time when the OODA loop was properly functioning. So this is a case where a broken OODA loop led to a let's call it an incumbent falling from power and an upstart gaining power. But what about a situation where you had a properly functioning OODA loop that worked. And the example I could think of, and maybe there's a better example out there, but the one that I was thinking of as I was preparing for our chat today is the Oakland A's, and the example that some of the audience may have been familiar with from either the book or the movie from with the same name, Moneyball.
So let's go there. But before we go there, I mean, just do the opposite side of the crash OODA loop, and just use Netflix to start, and look at how is Netflix able to do that to Blockbuster? How are they able to operate inside the OODA loop of a firm like Blockbuster? If you go on the Netflix website or you Google Netflix culture and you go on their website, you know, there's 5 things that they list as part of their culture. Number 1, they encourage independent decision-making by employees. Number 2, they share information open, broadly, deliberately. Number 3, they're extraordinarily candid with each other. Number 4, they keep only our highly effective people. And 5, they avoid rules. Well, that's a very differentiated orientation than probably 99% of companies in certainly in the United States, and I imagine other places too, right? So that kind of mindset, right? That kind of differentiation of orientation allowed them to do things faster, quicker than Blockbuster ever could have hoped to imagine, because that kind of stuff was not probably part of the culture of Netflix. So, you know, on one hand, in the Blockbuster Netflix, you look at one crashed OODA loop. In other words, an orientation that wasn't able to function effectively because it was misaligned with reality, versus one that was able to function effectively, was able to make the necessary learning and refinements and adjustments in order to adapt and basically be David to Blockbuster's Goliath. So that's the first place I would start. And then if you want to go into the Moneyball example, I'm happy to. That's another great one, you know.
Yeah, let's spend some time on Moneyball just to give a different example, given that the corporate world may be a little dry for some, and this is at least sports, so it's a slightly different implementation that some other in the audience might find a little bit more tangible for them.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great movie too, and a great book. And I don't know if there's a Blockbuster Netflix video out versus each other rather than that. I mean, the one that you just had up says a lot, but so Moneyball, right? So the theory emerged that the traditional way of picking baseball players, relying on the subjective value of so-called experts in the form of baseball scouts that were basically old men that had played baseball before in some shape or form, or had been part of organizations for some time. And so the general manager of the Oakland A's, played by Brad Pitt in the movie, he employs the work of a Yale-trained economist that uses econometrics to identify strengths and weaknesses of players quantitatively. And I don't know his name in real life, but the character was played by Jonah Hill in the movie. But basically, what he's showing is that the archaic way of evaluating players through the eyes of old men with subjective feelings, like he swings funny, or he stands funny, or he got dumped by his girlfriend, or he has no self-confidence, or whatever, right? All of those things were purely subjective, and they said nothing to the actual value of the players from a quantitative standpoint. So what this guy, he cracked the code, showing that really what you get paid for is wins and scoring runs and getting on base, not big names that can hit the ball hard, but they really in clutch situations they're overpaid, and they don't because they don't provide any value. So they quantitatively screened and built a team using quantitative data, sort of overruling, again, the subjective valuations of relying on anyway solely on the subjective valuations of old men that had been around the game for a long, long time.
One of the things that that to me struck me about this particular case is the fact that the different teams had sort of financial constraints around how they could spend their budget. Different teams had different available income to kind of spend on players. So it seemed like this was for them an innovative solution to maximizing the effect of the limited funds they had available to themselves. And the reason I thought this was an interesting example is that within that construct, they weren't going for like the big name stars that might be good at one aspect. They
Yeah.
seem to focus on a team approach where the combination of the players and how they kind of filled in for each other's gaps and maybe enhance themselves was more important than having just like the one name player or the one specific attribute.
So that's a great point. So teams that have constraints like the Oakland A's or the Kansas City Royals or Pittsburgh Pirates or whatever, like these quote unquote small market teams, they don't have the money to bring in big names like the Yankees could or the Red Sox could or the Cardinals could or whoever. So what they've got to start looking for, okay, we've got to shift our orientation, because what's always worked, this goes back to your comment about hammer and nail. If all we're going to have is a hammer, everything's going to look like a nail, and we're going to walk into a hammer nail game where our hammer is the smallest hammer and we're going to lose every time. So we've got to throw out the hammer and find something different. So basically what they did in the case of the A's, they shattered the model of how you historically evaluate baseball players by introducing a quantitative system that really nailed down on the things that you're talking about, sort of a team approach with quantitative screens that suggest a player was capable of, getting on base enough, or scoring enough runs in order to get the necessary amount of wins to make the playoffs. And when this came out, when this was going on, I mean, this was absolutely skewered from everybody. They're ruining the game. That's not the way you pick players. They don't know what they're doing. All these math types or whatever, these scientific types. But the reality is, it completely changed the way that players are evaluated. It's had a massive influence, not only on soccer, but in other sports. It's really interesting to point out that the owner of the Red Sox, that also operates with this, he used to be a trader. He was his name's John Henry, and he was a systematic trader that amassed a fortune being the opposite side of the Barings Bank long on the Japanese Nikkei index in the 90s.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, his system told them to go short when Barings Bank, the rogue trader. If you've ever, that might be another episode someday. Yeah, when Nick Leeson, the rogue trader, toppled the 400-year-old Barings Bank by going long the Nikkei when you should have been going short. The person on the other side of the trade was John Henry, and he amassed a fortune enough to buy. He owns the Red Sox. He owns the Liverpool Football Club. He owns the Boston Globe. I think he also owns the networks that all those things are shown on. Anyway, long story short, he's just, as a systematic trader, the mathematical methodology that they use is something similar or akin to what was being done. It's the same. Maybe it's like a different input, but when he bought the team and started doing it that way, the Red Sox all of a sudden have had 3 World Series wins. Whereas if you're growing up a New York Yankees fan myself, the Red Sox hadn't won a World Series since 1918. So when he took it over and changed the way that they did baseball business in Boston with a completely different orientation, it's just similar or akin to the Moneyball, it reversed course for them. And they've
bringing this back to the OODA Loop, how was it that orientation, like how did Billy Beane kind of settle on this orientation that was more aligned to truth when everything around him was like, it was a culture of the exact opposite? I mean, I understand how the owner of the Red Sox came from a financial background, systematic trading. I understand why his orientation was different, and I understand why that was more aligned with what wound up being successful. But Billy Beane doesn't seem to have that sort of pedigree, doesn't seem to have that sort of natural, okay, I get why he's thinking that way. So do you have any context you can share on that?
I would say that Billy Beane knew they weren't going to get the money. He was well aware of the constraints that Oakland had as a small market team. So going to ask for more money to compete with the New York Yankees of the world wasn't an option. And he was apt enough to realize that I can't go to war with the army I don't have. I have to go to war with the army that I do have, and I have to change the way that we do things, or else nothing's going to work. He readily recognized something had to change. So I think when he came in contact with this process, he was open to it. He's clearly not, I don't think he himself is a Yaley or a mathematician or anything like that. But I think that he was open to looking at something differently, because for him, it was more of a necessity. He had to do something different. And this seemed to make enough sense to him to was worth giving a try. And once he understood it, he became a strong advocate for it, in spite of, the ridicule and the basically the old men that had been doing this, the quote unquote experts for years. They might have been really good at analyzing, but they weren't really good at synthesizing. And remember, that's part of OODA Loop, analysis and synthesis. They weren't very good at synthesizing into something that hadn't previously existed. Because if you remember from the book and the movie, Billy Beane says, we just lost Jason Giambi to the Yankees. He's telling the scouts, you got to stop looking for Jason Giambi. You have to shatter your model, because we're not going to find one. And if we couldn't afford him anyway. So using a numbers approach, we can do it in the aggregate. We might be able to recreate him in the aggregate at a much lower cost and replace him that way. And that's sort of what they did.
But given that he was one man that came to this conclusion, how did he get the buy-in? Because at the end of the day, it could come back to being the Cassandra, that he's saying this is what needs to happen, but if no one buys in, then it's all for naught anyway. So
because
what was
the owner,
his approach?
The owner gave, so Billy Beane was in charge of of how the team operated, and the owner supported him as long as they would put themselves in a position to have a winning team. So Billy Beane had, as I understand it, he had complete free reign and control over how the team operated, how they selected players, how they kept players, how they would trade for players, etc. And if you read the book, and if you've even seen the movie, he's flat out telling the manager, like, stop not doing what I'm telling you to do, because I'm going to get rid of you. And he's in charge. Try this, and if it doesn't work, fine, I'm an idiot, and we won't do it anymore. But try it, So he had to. In a lot of cases, I think he had to really force it in. But then the end result is people realize, okay, we have a $40 million salary, and the Yankees are spending like $150 million, and we're competitive with them now. Okay, maybe we should start looking at something differently.
Now, I don't remember.
Basically, think of it this way. Maybe another way too. I mean, this is another thing that was an advantage for him, that he had to sell people on. Basically, you had to free up a lot of information. You had to sort of flatten he had to shatter the old way. There's a hierarchical way of, and it's medieval, right? Of just old men going to baseball games around the country. And if somebody's been around longer, his assessment's going to have more weight than me that hasn't been around as long. I mean, all that information is hoarded, and it's, in their system, it was open. Everything was transparent. The only quantifiable facts you could actually know about a player was the numbers that they would put on the board. Not that he stood funny or he swang funny or, his girlfriend dumped him or whatever. all of that stuff just didn't matter anymore because it really had no effect on how somebody would perform in a baseball game. So he had to nudge, he had to force, he had to shatter that orientation change, that they had to reorient. If they were going to have an effective competitive OODA loop versus say the Yankees or the Red Sox or whoever, something had to change, and whether it was brute force or getting rid of people that weren't on board, he had full reign to do that. And it paid off.
In our first example, it was company versus company. This one, it was much more one team versus the entire league because it wasn't just against a specific rival. It was against everyone in the space.
Yeah, and they were competitive with the third lowest payroll in all of baseball. So now people could say, well, that's the way the Yankees have always done it, and the Yankees have won more World Series championships. No, that's true. But they also have a bottomless money pit. And they're also in, the largest city in the United States, and a completely different revenue market for baseball than Oakland, California, or Pittsburgh, PA, or smaller market teams.
I don't remember if this was in the book, but I remember from the movie that the owner of the Red Sox actually offered Billy Beane the job at the Red Sox.
Yeah, and I think he turned it down.
No, he did. He stayed with the A's.
Yeah.
Now, I'm curious of your personal view as to why that decision may have been taken, given that it seems like you have Billy Beane had a process that was appreciated and in essence replicated at the Red Sox later because the owner was aligned with that viewpoint.
Why did Billy Beane not take the?
I don't know if you've seen anything in your research or your studies, or if you have a personal view. I was just curious if you had any observations on that.
I wonder. I don't really have any. I mean, he was loyal, I guess. I don't know. I really don't know why he didn't take the Boston job, and I don't recall from studying that.
Okay, well. It's just an interesting It's just for me an interesting observation that it seems like you're going from to a place that has equal alignment and thought processes.
Yeah, but remember, he didn't invent it; he brought it in.
True.
He didn't invent it. And John Henry, who, is a wildly successful systematic trader, and just a completely different background. He might not have been maybe that's just a suspicion, but maybe he just wasn't a fit for the Boston organization.
Well, I'm gonna pause right here and ask to see if there are any questions coming from the community. I did see one coming from a community member, Subspace. He wrote, OODA seems to facilitate revolution in an industry. But are there stories of how OODA affects evolution or slower, more methodical change?
Yeah, that's a great question. And evolution was certainly one of the things that in John Boyd's, if you look at the epistemology of how he came up with the OODA loop, and remember this was OODA loop was illustrated a year before he passed away in 1997, but it was the culmination of 40 plus years of intense academic labor. Evolution was a massive thing. So OODA can happen at different scales. Orientations can change violently, quickly, or gradual, or over time. Can it be used in a, like we were talking about, like a David and Goliath, sort of like upending, upheaval, disruptive situation? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those are the stories that we know the most. But then just think of things that have drifted over time, where orientations have changed, maybe not immediately, but over time. What's acceptable now in 2022 might not have been acceptable in 1976. And what was acceptable in 1976 might not have been acceptable in 1952. And what was acceptable in 1952. So like over time, you have to think of OODA again as fractal, both in time and space. So I think that question's right on. And yes, I would answer that. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't have to be quickly and violently. It can be gradual and over much longer periods of time.
Yeah, because the other comment he made immediately after the question was that when you get to your lowest point, you will listen to any idea.
Not necessarily.
Any example come to mind that because that was a pretty quick and emphatic, not necessarily.
Not necessarily. People are wedded to their decisions or their biases or their feelings or whatever it is they believe. They'll ride it all the way to the bottom.
Any example come to mind?
I mean, think of the world where we came from. You mentioned TradFi. I mean, and we're both from originally from the capital market space. How many analysts do you know that fell in love with a stock and rode it all the way to the bottom because it was their idea, and they knew they were right, and they're never going to give up on being right, and they're going to ride it till it goes to zero because they can't let go of their connection to it or whatever, right? They just can't let go. They just can't imagine that they're wrong. Great book on that, by the way. If you've read Bomber Mafia by Malcolm Gladwell recently, he had an example where a lot of these Air Force generals, like, they couldn't give up their preconceived notions and they couldn't change. And then all of a sudden they went from successful to unsuccessful. And they kept doubling down on what used to work, and it doesn't work anymore. But we're going to triple down, and think of, companies do this all the time. Well, we did this last time. All right, well, do it twice as hard. And I knew do it 4 times as hard, and all it's all futile. It all just makes it worse because they're unwilling to give up their understanding or their biases or their comfort, whatever it is that's forcing them not to see that. Again, it's implicitly guiding and controlling their observations with blinders on. Yeah, people have a hard time giving that up. I mean, think of all the things that come out in the news all the time. Something's been proven wrong or something, and then, like, people they can't let go. There was a book, I can't think of the name of the book, and I have it in my library here. It's a book that Malcolm Gladwell refers to. I think it's called When Prophecy Fails, and he referred to it in the story. And by the way, Bomber Mafia, I highly recommend. And I think the way he designed it was actually to be listened to, not read. But anyway, there's
I dropped a link in the channel.
Yeah, and there's this book in there called When Prophecy Fails that he refers to. And basically what it was some psychologist, I think the last name was Festinger. He goes to observe some, by Festinger, When Prophecy Fails. So he's a psychologist, Leon Festinger. He's one of the most famous social psychologists, and he's going to go out in suburban Chicago, and he's going to observe this cult that follows this woman named Dorothy Martin. And this is like in the 50s. And she's saying that the aliens are going to be here at 4:00 on December 17th. And then they didn't come at 4:00. Well, then she says midnight. And then she says, "Oh, I talked to the aliens and they gave me a new date. It's actually December 21st. It's on the solstice, right?" And then nothing happens. "Oh, I'm sorry, it's on New Year's Eve." But what was interesting, though, like, people couldn't let go of these beliefs, and this is a really big thing about orientation. And this is quoting Malcolm Gladwell directly. What did Festinger make of all this? Right, like this cult in suburban Chicago waiting for the aliens and the flying saucer to come get them. Here's the answer. The more, and I quote, "the more you invest in a set of beliefs, the greater the sacrifice you make in the service of that conviction, the more resistance you will be to evidence that suggests that you are mistaken. You don't give up. You double down." And I don't know. I mean, anybody can think of countless examples where they've seen somebody do exactly that. They're so heavily invested in something, or they believe it so much because, my family verified it, or I saw it on my favorite channel, or whatever. And even though evidence comes to show me the contrary, it doesn't matter.
Well,
I'm
that
just
goes
going to.
back to the behavioral bias we talked about in our first stream together
Yep.
about confirmation bias. You're more
Well,
willing to accept data that confirms your viewpoint and discard things that don't.
and it's also too what we started the conversation with. The reason why there's no Blockbuster, the reason why there's no more Kodak like we knew it, the reason that there's none of that, because they just couldn't give up their perceptions, even in the light of evidence that proves contrary. And it's, that's one thing I love about markets and trading and other things, is that I get the fact. What's the one fact? Price. I just look at price, right? Like I'm going to try to eliminate all of those other things that are going to have an influence on me that might misshape my observation. If I'm reading everything from one source, or if I'm only listening to one source and I don't get other perspectives, then I'm going to set myself up for failure, because I'm not going to be able to anticipate or be prepared for something that's different. There's a great Boyd example. If I showed you an isosceles triangle, a square, an isosceles triangle with a line down the middle, or a square with an X through it, and people will argue to the death that it's an isosceles triangle. They'll argue to the death that it's a square, but no one's ever going to say, hey, you know what? I might be looking at one side of a pyramid, and that's the correct answer. And rather than say, hey, I'm pretty sure what I'm looking at is an isosceles triangle. However, I'm open to the possibility that it might be one side of a pyramid. So I'm gonna go ahead and act as if it's an isosceles triangle. But however, I'm gonna set up contingencies just in case it turns out to be a pyramid. Just in case I'm looking at one side of a pyramid, right? That's what people. That's what when you're good at OODA, and you learn it, and it's a lifelong commitment to study and to be engaged and all that stuff. You have to hold on to things, but you have to hold them loosely, because you could be proven wrong. And if you're wrong, or if your observations are misaligned with reality, it's going to negatively affect how you decide and how you act as time unfolds. So that's the critical, crucial lesson for this, is that you have to be willing to change in the light of new information, to reorient and shift your models and shatter your previous models in order to operate effectively going forward. That's what Billy Beane did. That's what Boston Red Sox did. That's what, John Henry did when he was going short the Nikkei, when Nick Leeson and Barings Bank were going long, right? I mean, that's how orientations differentiate. And if you're right, or if you're aligned with reality and you continue to adapt to that reality, you're probably going to be more successful in the long run than someone that doesn't.
No, absolutely. And one, excuse me. And one way that we mentioned earlier earlier today that a corporation might be able to deal with it is to have a dedicated red team that is actually empowered.
That's one way. Another way we didn't talk about, but it makes sense, right? Like decentralization. That when the mission of the company is crystal clear and understood by all, people at the lowest level can make the decisions fast without having to go back and ask for permission. I'll give you a really easy example. When I would take young kids, my kids are all grown now, but when I were young and we go to Disney World, everybody in Disney, my perception as a consumer was, from the CEO all the way down to the people sweeping trash up, everybody's bought into the mission of making dreams come true. So employees are empowered to execute action aligned with mission at their level without in sort of a decentralized format that allows them to take care of issues faster as they come up, rather than dragging them out, rather than elongating the process. So yeah, a red team works. Decentralization works.
Alignment of mission is critical, though.
Yeah, alignment of mission is critical. You don't have that, you don't have anything. Like vision and mission have to be aligned. Everybody's got to understand the vision. Everybody's got to understand the mission that is to achieve the vision, right? And then the other thing I would say, kind of like in the Moneyball case, information has to be democratized. It has to be open source. Everybody has to have access to it, because you never know who's going to have a perspective that you need. And and you're setting yourselves up for failure to think, well, no one's going to need to know that, or no one would know that but me, or no, you're setting yourself up for failure right there.
Yeah.
So
No,
that's
all very
way
valid.
to say again.
I said no, that's all very valid. It's almost like a network of these elements together is what helps guard against it, not any one in particular.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to be open to all possibilities because the future is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. We're bearing uncertainty as investors, as regardless of what we're investing in or whatever we're doing, we're constantly acting under conditions of uncertainty. So that orientation has to be agile and flexible enough to change when we encounter a reality that we didn't previously anticipate. We have to be flexible and agile enough to do it.
Well, I'm not seeing
I'll give you one final example, right?
Sure.
If you're a value analyst, right? You hear that, I'm a value person. Oh, I'm all value. Boy, Enron looked really good when it went from, whatever its high was to down to say, like, I don't know, it's only $30 a share. Wow. It's only, and people will ride it all the way, all the way down to the bottom.
Yeah. No, that's
again. I'll quote it one more time from that Gladwell Balmer Mafia in quotes. The more you invest in a set of beliefs, the greater the sacrifice you make in the service of that conviction, the more resistance you will be to evidence that suggests that you are mistaken. You don't give up, you double down. That's a very dangerous behavior. And it can be fatal.
No, absolutely. But unfortunately, a lot of reward mechanisms are there for having strong conviction and less so for flexibility of thought and agility until the, let's call it the worst case scenario, in which case agility was what's rewarded, but the conviction is what blew you up.
And the good news is this: it doesn't have to be that way. So for those that are willing to challenge all assumptions, it doesn't have to be that way for you. You're not predestined to be completely stuck in your models and only operate within that constraint. You can shatter that models in the light of new information and adjust accordingly in order to improve your capacity for free and independent action.
Well, on that note, I'm going to take the opportunity to once again thank you for all your time today and sharing your knowledge, Phoenix, and thank you to all our listeners. I hope that you learned something today.
Thanks, and I hope everybody has a great rest of the week.
All right. Thanks a lot, Phoenix. Have a good one.